All right. Well, let's get started. This may be the smoothest technical situation we've had all day, so I'm really excited about that. So my name is Katie Scott. I'm the senior youth attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. For those who may have participated in the earlier session, um, the State Index on Youth Homelessness 101, this next slide might be a bit of a repeat of what you've heard, but we're just going to do sort of a brief recap so that everyone knows what we are talking about here. And just give me a second. I need to kind of pin my video. Oh, that's not pinned. Hold on a second. Pin myself. All right. So the State Index on Youth Homelessness, it's basically a 50 state plus DC evaluation on investments towards preventing and ending youth homelessness. And we look at certain metrics and benchmarks. And so these are broken into law and policy benchmarks, systems benchmarks, and environmental benchmarks. In the law and policy section, we kind of break it down further into 5 major categories. Whether the state has comprehensive laws and policies ensuring supports and services for unhoused youth. Unhoused youth contact with the criminal and juvenile legal systems are limited or prevented. The state provides unaccompanied youth opportunity to seek legal independence and live independently. The state addresses educational needs of unhoused youth experiencing homelessness. And then finally, the state allows unhoused youth to access critical public benefit supports and services. So, and then as far as like systems and environment, those are things that we're looking at. Is there a sort of at the state level, a youth advisory board who's helping direct, youth homelessness efforts? As for environment, does the state have sexual orientation and gender identity protections for their services for youth, including things like the child welfare system and the juvenile, we don't really like to call it the juvenile justice system, the juvenile punishment system. So anyway, those are the sort of things that the index evaluates. And as you can see, sort of from this graphic here, some states get a passing score, more states get a low score, and I think we might even have, well, I guess it's not quite as many states get a critically low score. So this information, the full report, the Youth State Index on Homelessness, can be found at www.youthstateindex.org. There's a report. There's some information about how you can sign up to get involved with advocacy around the index. You can look at each state, see the report card for your state. So it's a great way to just kind of get an overview of the general environment in your state. And I'm going to put the website in the chat. So just hold on for a second here. Right. And just making sure Aaliyah, who's on the online with us, can make sure that I'm giving the correct web address there as I'm typing it in while we chat. Okay. So let's move on to sort of the meat of this discussion that I wanted to get into. It's like we've got sort of this evaluation of the various policies. Let's take a look at what some of these things are actually looking like on the ground in regards to like youth experience of how these metrics interact with their lives. And then from there, I want to get into sort of a policy discussion where we can talk a little bit more about where we can go from here. So I guess I had one other slide before we get into that. So why do we measure this information? So sort of like a SWOT analysis, we can see the strengths of each state, the weaknesses, some opportunities, some threats. We do have a special supplement this year about the various laws that were passed regarding making it more difficult to be trans youth in this country, that were happening in a bunch of these laws got passed or proposed in 2022. We do have a supplement on the State Index website, or a section of our report that addresses some of those. On each state report card, you can kind of see some of the strengths, and then you can also see some of the weaknesses and opportunities. one thing, like one reason that we continue to publish this is that lawmakers are often interested in data. Like, why do we score low and another state doesn't? Where are the gaps? Can we visualize the data in a helpful way to like make our argument? I kind of listed here. It's actually funny. This list won't be accurate anymore because some of these legislators, unfortunately, are no longer going to be continuing in 2023. But these legislators listed here are all interested in youth homelessness issues. They actually participated in a youth homelessness fellows program this year through the National Conference of State Legislators. So these are folks that if they are in your state, you can call on them when you have youth homelessness advocacy goals. Another thing, and we talked about this in the first session, is sort of identifying that low-hanging fruit. One thing that's great about youth homelessness advocacy is there is often the ability to actually get bipartisan support for some of these things. You know, it's usually, it can be an easier sell than some other types of advocacy efforts. And so it's helpful if we can identify some of those particular things that we can sort of easily get done. But what we really want to figure out eventually is like, what are the policies that actually move the needle on youth homelessness? And so that's sort of our goal for the future of this index. You know, right now we're just tracking. In the future, we would like to figure out not only are we tracking these laws, but then what is the actual effect of them? And are there other things we should be tracking to figure out, you know, what's the most effective policies? Another thing that we're looking at, and we'll talk more about this later too, is sort of the difference between reform-minded, harm reduction type advocacy efforts, and then advocacy efforts that move more towards transformational systems change. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. I'm never quite sure why this does not move forward. There we go. All right, so to see how some of these index metrics play out in real life, we're gonna walk a mile in the shoes of an unhoused youth, and then a bit in the shoes of a caseworker as they try to navigate a youth homelessness system in what I'm calling a middle of the road state. So this isn't a state that's like has the absolute worst policies for unhoused youth, but it's also not one that necessarily has like for instance, like Washington State, they score 100% on their systems because they have a very coordinated youth homelessness response system at the state level. So this state doesn't quite have that, but they also aren't necessarily ones that are, you know, in a really bad way. Like for instance, they don't have conversion therapy for LGBTQ youth. So that's the kind of state that we're talking about. Sometimes when I run this presentation, we truly do it in a choose your own adventure style where the audience needs to make the decisions. But I think for our purposes, we're kind of a small group. What we'll do is we'll kind of go through the different pathways and sort of identify some of those choke points. Feel free as we're going through, if there's a question, you know, put it in the chat. Those my small but mighty group in the room, feel free to interrupt me, and we'll do a question. I definitely, you know, this does not have to be a super formal experience. All right, so the youth that we're following in this exercise is a 17-year-old transgender youth named Summer. Summer was kicked out by her family after coming out. Summer slept over at a friend's house for the weekend, but the friend isn't willing to ask their parents if Summer can stay long term. Plus, they aren't sure if they could get in trouble for having Summer actually stay there. And I don't know if anyone knows why there might be potential trouble for the family of the friend that Summer is staying with. But one of the things that we measure in the index is metric 23, harboring a runaway. This is actually a crime in 23 states. So in 23 states, there could actually be some kind of criminal consequence for Summer or for the family that Summer is staying with. I should also say that, you know, this story and person that we're following, it's sort of a combination of folks that I've represented in the past. There was also an excellent article in the Washington Post, I think about a year ago, that was talking about the disproportionality of LGBTQ youth in the represented among the homeless population in Washington, D.C. And it followed an older youth but that had many of these same hit many of these same issues that Summer will as we go through the presentation. So I just wanted to give some credit there to that particular article. I think I have it linked later on in the presentation, and I'll put that in the chat. Okay, so first option, Summer can no longer stay at her friend's house. Where does Summer sleep tonight? We can choose a youth shelter or outside. Luckily, there maybe even is a youth shelter in the area where Summer lives. I think first we will go through the shelter options. This jumped ahead to where it shouldn't have. There we go. So the youth shelter actually has space, so that's good news. But unfortunately, they don't allow pets. So Summer actually has her dog Buddy with her. And Summer doesn't particularly feel safe without her pet. The youth shelter can either call animal shelter to come pick up Buddy, but there is no guarantee that Summer will get her back if she leaves the shelter. So do you agree to give up Buddy and stay at the shelter, or do you choose to leave and sleep outside? We'll go with the scenario of agreeing to give up Buddy for now. We'll go back. Oh gosh, this is like jumping around in the way it's not supposed to. All right, so before you decide about Buddy, there is one more consideration. The shelter is required by law to promptly notify your parents, or if there's evidence of abuse or neglect, the police and CPS when an unaccompanied youth comes seeking shelter. So you don't want them to contact your parents, and you don't want them to contact the police. Do you stay at the shelter? Do you decide to sleep outside? So we're going to continue through the shelter process now. And unfortunately, this is not letting me go through it in the way that it's supposed to. But we'll go to sort of this option. So basically, the shelter notifies police and CPS that you're at the shelter and a possible victim of abuse or neglect. However, in contacting the police, the shelter finds out that Summer has an outstanding warrant for shoplifting. Summer is arrested and taken to detention. However, after determining you have nowhere to go, the police contact CPS, and CPS essentially takes you back to the shelter. So let's try again. We'll go through the outside scenario now. So basically, at this point, Summer is leaving the shelter, staying in a park. Unfortunately, Summer is then arrested and taken to juvenile detention. Summer's in the park after curfew. Again, we're on the same loop. After determining Summer has nowhere to go, the CPS is contacted, and CPS, for anyone who's not sure, it's called different things in different states. Child Protective Services. Sometimes we could just say the Child Welfare System. Summer is then taken back to shelter. All right, we're going to try again. So Summer is choosing to sleep outside. After leaving the shelter, however, Summer runs into an older acquaintance that offers Summer a place to stay and is actually okay with Summer bringing Buddy. Do you go with them, or do you stay outside? Summer decides to go with the older acquaintance in this scenario. Summer stays with the older acquaintance for a few days, but feels really unsafe there. Summer doesn't have any privacy. Her host is making her feel very uncomfortable. So now we have, again, a choke point. Do you stay? It's a roof over your head. Do you leave and sleep outside? Summer decides to stay in this scenario. So one thing we didn't mention in the scenario yet, and we'll talk about a little bit in the caseworker choose your own adventure, but Summer decides to stay and has somehow been managing to get to school through this crisis, these crisis points. So Summer stays, but decides to confide in a school counselor about what is happening. They, of course, then contact Child Welfare Services against Summer's wishes. So CPS at this point intervenes. They're able to get Summer's parents to agree to let her stay 30 days at the youth shelter. But unfortunately, Child Welfare does not prioritize teenagers for services and closes Summer's file without taking any other action. This is a fairly common scenario. I think we'll kind of go back a little bit just to kind of talk through some of the scenarios that we've seen here. So one, the fact that Summer, upon entry to the shelter, was the shelter was required to sort of immediately notify police, child welfare, or Summer's parents. That's something that we track in the index. And so one way that a state can get around that is through delay of notification requirements. 29 states actually do not allow delay of notification. A lot of states where that is allowed, it's usually about a 72-hour delay, so not great, but it does at least give the shelter a little bit of time to stabilize the youth that is coming to the shelter. No need to make any urgent decisions about who needs to be contacted within those first few days, and just gives a little breathing room for that youth. There are some states that do allow unaccompanied youth to actually just fully consent to emergency shelter. In that scenario, as long as the shelter staff feels that the youth truly is unaccompanied, they are fully responsible sort of for their own finding their own shelter and meeting their own needs. The shelter then can allow the youth on their own to consent. Even in those scenarios, usually that consent is limited to about this 30-day window. And there's several reasons for that, but one of them is that generally in our federal funding for youth homelessness programs, shelter programs like this are supposed to be sort of a very temporary solution, like a 30-day solution. And so that's why we're going to kind of jump into some of the conversation now about once a youth manages to get to a shelter, what sort of that 30-day window starts ticking, and the case managers at the shelter, presuming that there are case managers at the shelter, are able to start figuring out, how can they figure out a more permanent solution for Summer. The other thing I just want to mention that we kind of went over in this section is just the issue of curfew. So curfew is generally something that's decided not on a state level. It is generally municipalities that are imposing curfews for youth under 18, or depending on, there's certain states where the age of majority is a little older, like 19, or I think even one state, the age of majority is actually 21. If if a youth is in a park after curfew hours, one, it becomes, if there is a curfew, it becomes an excuse for a law enforcement to have contact with that youth. Two, some states or municipalities do have exceptions for homeless youth for curfew violations. So while they may not then end up, in juvenile detention or with that on their record, it's really still dependent on law enforcement to make that determination. And so it's just, not an ideal situation to help that particular youth. Furthermore, if the, law enforcement does not have anywhere for that youth to go, there are actually states, and I will look up here, basically 14 states still allow homeless youth to be detained in secure facilities. So for some states that might be juvenile detention. Some states have this kind of in between. It's called like a semi-secure facility. I think it's like trying to get around calling it a detention for youth just because they are homeless. But essentially, that interaction with law enforcement, sort of the excuse of curfews, just sort of gives the excuse for law enforcement to essentially be approaching youth in that situation from a criminalization, perspective, rather than from like a helping perspective. So that's something that we're definitely looking at the Law Center of how can we either improve or repeal curfew laws across the country. Okay, so let's kind of switch over, and I'll just pause for a second. Does anyone have any questions thus far as we sort of go through this initial youth homelessness system? All right, we will move along. Okay, so we're switching gears here. You are now a case manager at a youth shelter. Summer, a transgender teenager, has essentially been abandoned at the shelter by her parents and the child welfare system. Summer has been at the shelter for a week and the clock is ticking. Summer has a state ID, but it does not match her name or gender. She has a pending charge for shoplifting. She's managing to get to school most days, but is struggling with depression. When asked what her goals are, she states that she just wants to get Buddy back and maybe live in her own apartment. She's interested in getting a job or maybe participating in job training, but way too overwhelmed to manage it on top of everything else. So, caseworker, do you try to deal with the legal problems first, figuring out the ID, quashing the warrant, try to find a placement in transitional housing program for teens, and then deal with the legal issues and mental health issues, or try to help Summer access mental health care? And I will take, let's do a poll of what folks would choose in this situation. Feel free to put in the chat. You could just say legal, housing, mental health, the 3 choices. And what about in the room? Who would deal with legal problems first? What about transitional housing first? What about mental health care first? Any thoughts? Okay, we've got a vote.
Yeah, I like housing first.
Yeah.
I like the word transitional.
Yeah.
Housing. That's my hesitation on.
Yeah. All right, so we.
Which takes time.
Yeah. Yeah, and so just so that folks on the Zoom can hear, we've got a similar chat here, but yes, like one of the points in the room was, aren't you going to need the ID first to be able to even get into housing? So let's actually, we'll bump through my links. We'll try to find the placement in the transitional housing program first and see where we go. Okay, so all of the transitional or longer term housing programs will not accept a youth with a warrant and require that youth have a birth certificate, social security card, and state ID. So yeah. Yep, that's exactly it. It's like, I guess in our scenario, we should be glad that the shelter didn't require this for Summer to stay, right? Like, I just did sort of, when I was putting this together, like a quick search of a variety of different transitional housing programs. And like literally the language from the website, unfortunately, this program is unable to accept participants with a pending warrant, indictment, or presentment. All participants must have and maintain a birth certificate, social security card, and state ID card. So it's just, this is unfortunately a ridiculously common issue. I would say a completely unnecessary barrier. And, let's get youth housed first, and then we can try to work on some of these other things. All right, so let's go back. Let's go with dealing with legal problems first and see what happens there. Okay, so luckily, there is a legal aid attorney who comes to the shelter each week. And Summer is able to meet with them and begin the name and gender marker change process for her birth certificate and state ID and quash her warrant. So that's great. After speaking with the attorney, though, Summer decides that she wants to pursue emancipation so that she can live independently. You are worried that Summer is not ready to live independently. So do you help Summer access public assistance so she has a source of income for emancipation? Try to determine if there is a safe place and safe person in Summer's life that she could live with, emancipated or not. Encourage Summer to try to re-engage with CPS so she'll be eligible for extended foster care benefits when she turns 18. So let's do another vote. Are we going to help Summer access public assistance? Are we going to, so we'll say public assistance, safe person, or CPS, with the idea that then Summer would be eligible for some of these extended foster care benefits there are some like housing voucher programs and things specifically for former foster youth.
This is like Jumanji.
Yeah, I know. I don't like any of the choices. I know. All right, we're going for A or C, and I like the point leaning towards A because that's what Summer wants. And I think, just as an attorney, I'll say that one thing that I really liked about being a youth attorney is one, I'm not a mandated reporter. All, conversation that youth would have with me would be confidential. I also took very seriously that like this was youth-led representation. Like it's not my agenda, it's the youth's agenda. There were plenty of other people in the youth's life that were sort of pushing their, what's best for the youth. And so it was a real benefit, I think, to have youth have access to attorneys to be able to sort of have their own, wishes followed. But so let's try the public assistance option and see what happens. Oh no. Come on. All right, we might just have to do this the old-fashioned way. Okay. So unfortunately, the only benefits available are for parenting youth. That would be temporary assistance for needy families, or disabled youth. That would be the SSI program. If Summer lived with a relative or even an unrelated adult, they could apply for child-only TANF on her behalf and food assistance. Summer might be able to access those benefits directly, but it will almost definitely require the help of an attorney to navigate the bureaucracy. There is also no guarantee, of course, that if Summer was living with a relative or an unrelated adult, that they would, in fact, if they were able to access those benefits for Summer, that they would be able to, that Summer would actually get the benefit of those things. So let's go back and we'll take a little, we'll go for C. And I do think it's interesting that everyone, so we had no votes for B, so we'll definitely do that one last, but we'll go with the extended foster care system first and see what happens. Let's see. Okay. Hold on a second. Okay. So after a lot of persistence, you're able to get Summer assigned a social worker with CPS. CPS is able to help Summer work out an agreement with her parents for her to live with her adult cousin and provide her cousin supports through the kinship care program, which I apologize, my little speaker thing is blocking some of the text there. So I'm just going to kind of just mention briefly. So one, we're kind of running into that issue of like, well, why should it be so hard to get a 17-year-old? Like, this is the child welfare system. They are supposed to be serving children up to the age of majority. Why is it so difficult to actually get help from CPS? And I think that in general, it's just a matter of resources. Like, the child welfare system, which we can talk about all the problems of the child welfare system later, but the reality is that there is not priority for teenagers. And my experience as an attorney was like, we could almost never, if a youth was 15, like at that point, that was it. They were on their own. Like there was no strong effort to even get them placed into like a foster care placement. This may be different in different states. I'm kind of speaking from the perspective of Washington State. But what this brings up is sort of the need for sort of like additional kinds of housing options for youth. And so one of these things is like a kinship care program. And I'll just briefly sort of mention, like in case people don't know exactly what that is, but it's usually a program that's essentially supported, through the child welfare program that would allow a youth who has a relative that is not their parent to kind of jump in to sort of be that guardian. And ideally, it would have a couple different benefits. One, it wouldn't necessarily sever the parent-child relationship. So if there is a desire amongst the youth to be able to reunify with their family at some point, once conflict is resolved or situation gets better at home, it kind of leaves that option open. Obviously, it's good to keep a youth sort of within their family of origin. And it's so it's kind of and then also it does give the option where like even if the youth even if like the parent-child relationship is severed and the youth is officially in the custody of the state, it would be a way to place a youth, with a family member rather than with foster family. So anyway, but as we'll say, this isn't necessarily a perfect solution. So Summer now lives in a different school district. She misses several weeks of school while her caseworker tries to get transportation set up. Summer is feeling isolated from her friends, and CPS does not provide the promised support to her cousin. There has been one check-in in the 4 months that Summer has lived there, and 0 returned calls, when they have reached out for support. Summer still hasn't been able to access mental health care, can't find an LGBTQ affirming therapist that takes state health insurance, and things are reaching a crisis point. So does Summer live in Texas? So Summer does not live in Texas, because we're going kind of on like a middle of the road state. But I kind of put this point in here because, like, even if we're not even trying to get to the standard of like culturally competent mental health care, like this could be Summer could be like, someone who immigrated from a different country and had, needs some culturally competent care, specialized care, even getting just regular old standard mental health counseling through Medicaid, right. It's a huge barrier, right? Like it's just becomes very difficult to do. So Summer leaves her cousin's house. Don't worry, I'm not going to make us start all the way over. We'll go back a little bit and kind of look at some of the pain points that we missed as we go through this process. All right, here we go. Oh no, we're going the wrong direction. Why? It just like makes no sense. I know we're getting to Away Home America. Don't worry. Okay, so let's take a look. Try to determine if there's a safe person in Summer's life that she could live with, emancipated or not. So we're going to click on this one, and just because I wanted to highlight another alternate housing option. So Summer mentions the friend that she stayed with when she was first kicked out. Unfortunately, though, your state doesn't have a host homes program or only allows host homes as an option for youth over 18. Summer does have an older cousin who lives in the area. They used to be close, and she thinks the cousin would be supportive of her, but not sure if she could live there. Your state does have a process for kinship care, but it can only be accessed via the child welfare system. So we kind of already went through that scenario, but sort of going back to the friend's house, one sort of innovative thing, and I believe that this is something that, really shows us the benefit of unhoused youth having a voice and what kind of services would be helpful for them, is the host homes program. I'm just reading, from some of the programs. The host homes programs provides housing, case management, and support to homeless youth aged 16 to 22 in local homes. It's like an aunt or uncle's house, a place where you stay for a year or two to get back on your feet. It's essentially almost like a foster home, except without all of the structure and rules and that sort of it essentially allows for independence, right? It's not like you're switching your situation that you had with your parents for another set of foster parents. Instead, you essentially are offered house room for someone who is supportive. They do have to go through, background checks and things like that and meet certain qualifications. The room that they have to offer has to meet certain qualifications, but essentially allows a youth to live independently, but still have like house room in a safe house. So one question that came in the chat, is there an example website or state who does have host homes? Would love to see if it's something to bring up here in Delaware. So Point Source Youth is a great place to look for information about host homes. I wonder if someone in the chat, like maybe Jeremy or Aaliyah, would be willing to put the link to Point Source Youth in the chat. But I think that would be a good place to start. Another one, I think it's sort of like an acronym, like Give Youth Experiencing Homelessness a Home. So if you Googled that, you may find another program. Another thing I like is like a description from this is actually the Point Source Youth one. It's essentially it's a place where young people have time to repair their relationships with self-identified and chosen family and make decisions about other housing options with the support of a caring housing case manager or affirming adult mentor. So essentially, someone who it's not completely without support. Sort of the point is that they have some support of the other folks who are in the home, but aren't necessarily, but are still kind of given the independence that they've essentially earned by surviving on their own. All right. So one other thing I just want to mention, I won't go all the way back to it, but we did talk about this in the 101 session this morning, is just this issue of youth being unable to consent to their own mental health treatment. So forget even the aspect of can they even access a counselor through, the state health insurance programs that they might be on, or if, maybe they might still be under their parents' health insurance. That's also, for sure something to look into if you're working with youth, even if they are out of the house, they may still be entitled to stay on their parents' healthcare system. But then we have the problem of if the youth can even consent to receiving treatment for mental health or medication for mental health. The other problem that we run into is confidentiality. If the youth accesses these services, especially let's say it's through maybe their parents' insurance or something like that, are these records going to be kept confidential from their parents, from child welfare system, things like that? So those are some of the issues that we, are worrying about as well. Okay, let's take a look. And just to give you the scope, luckily the mental health treatment issue, at this point, we only have 9 states that explicitly do not allow that. So that is definitely like an area for advocacy. Maybe we could get to all 50 states at some point allowing access. And I believe DC already does. So we'll leave DC out of it for now. All right, let's see if we can get to the end of our. Okay, so at this point we're at, we're gonna stop in Summer's story. Obviously, as you can imagine, there's, we could move forward with these scenarios of, how would Summer transition even from shelter or host home or kinship care to independent living. So these are other things that we would want to think about as we're trying to make laws, policies, and systems better. So one thing I just want to bring up is something that we are following at the Law Center is Away Home America's New Deal framework. And we really love sort of this, the excellent work that Away Home America has done in putting together this structure for us to think about our advocacy opportunities. So there are, first we have sort of reform efforts. Those are sort of those immediate harm reduction opportunities. Can we improve access to the current existing systems? And still produce positive outcomes even while working within a system that we basically know needs to be thrown out and started over. Then there's sort of this middle phase, the transformative edge of reform. So pushing the edge of what's possible under our current system. So challenging power, listening to young people, like actually having something like the host homes, like let's figure out what it is that young people find would be helpful as they're navigating through the system. And removing the barriers that are preventing us from moving forward into like more transformative efforts. And then finally, transformation. We're going to reorient our systems towards justice by redistributing resources and power young people need to thrive. And this was just a quote from their website. So ending youth and young adult homelessness will require transformation and reorientation towards justice in the nation's major systems serving young people, systems currently rooted in structural racism. And I think that's really what it comes down to is, the limits of things like the current child welfare system, the current juvenile legal system. These are all systems that it's just inevitable. As much as we reform them, there is a racist history there of sort of who is targeted, who's overrepresented in those systems. And so as much as we want to make things better for youth right now within those systems, we need to, as advocates, be looking towards how are we going to actually transform those things. So I just wanted to throw it open to the group, like when we're thinking about reform efforts, like as I described, how do we make the situation slightly better for Summer? Like not quite as hard, like what are some of the things that came up that we could, easily fix? Or maybe not even easily fix, but make an effort to fix. And feel free to put anything in the chat. And if folks don't have immediate thoughts, don't worry, I do. So I'll throw mine up in just a minute here after I give people a second, in case anyone has something from the chat. Oh yeah, I love that. Funding to support programs. I think that's right. I mean, that's the oftentimes when we're starting a new program, we immediately under-resource it. And so then we can say, people can say, oh, the program didn't work, it was a waste of money. But in fact, we didn't actually put the resources towards it that we need. I think that's crucial too. Training and support for counselors. Yeah.
Business prevention, I think a lot of the is for you have to be literally helping countries. And there's not, if you're in a hotel, you don't qualify.
Yep.
If you're on your own, if you book yourself into a hotel, you're not helping. So there's a lot of like these guidelines and requirements that make it like they're literally telling people you have to become homeless in order to access any type of
access the services 100%. And that's a great, so I'll just say it a little louder so that you guys can hear it on the Zoom, but just this issue of like prevention. Why should you have to become literally homeless to qualify for certain services, like homeless on the street? Can we access resources and services before it gets to that point? I think that the that prevention aspect is really key. And let's prevent Summer from ending up on the street. So I'm just going to scroll back up a little bit to kind of see what else. Education for the public. We literally just had like this lunchtime conversation about messaging around homelessness. It is such a big deal. Now, one thing I will say is I think in youth homelessness, we have a bit of an advantage because people often there's not as much of that like blame situation, right? It's like people are, there's a lot more compassion often for youth. Now, of course, there's racism in our country as well, right? So there's compassion for youth, but then as soon as, a youth
depends on what part of the youth spectrum we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if we're talking about a 17-year-old, Black kid, like, it's suddenly, they're an adult and, they should be tried as an adult for some kind of crime. So it's just, it is still a tricky communications effort to try to message about these things. But I do think we can take advantage of oftentimes like, people's more compassionate stance towards youth. Let's take a look a bit more. And yes, just like the training for counselors, we need more culturally competent services across the board, more resources and options to schools. And this piece, I agree as well, like just, Summer happened to have a counselor at her school. So, and, was the counselor super helpful? I don't know. All we know is that the counselor in this scenario, referred Summer to child welfare because they were, counselor was worried about Summer's safety. That being said, like a lot of schools are sharing counselors. There's like not even anyone on full-time staff that's a counselor. And then on top of that, are, counselors in schools, are mental health professionals, are they being trained in culturally competent services? And then, funding restrictions, I think in general, about the issue of people needing to be literally houseless before they can access services. And I think what this also brings up is just the issue of family homelessness, right? Because obviously youth are generally connected to some kind of family structure. And so, when the family becomes homeless, it becomes even more difficult for the youth to be sheltered because there are situations where like certain shelters won't even allow teenagers, like, or teenage boys. I mean, it's just like, there's just all these problems like that are causing, even if the family does not want to be split up, the family wants to stay together. Just the realities of homelessness, create those problems. All right, let's take a look. Let me see if we hit most of the stuff I think that I was thinking of, because we kind of hit it as we were talking through the presentation, but these are just some of the kind of quick, like, delay of notification requirements at shelter, low barrier shelters. That's the other piece. Like, we didn't even address in this situation whether this shelter that Summer went to was inclusive of all genders, right? And, we'll presume that it was, that didn't come up as an issue in the scenario, but that's a huge problem. And And then also just being, allowing people to have pets. And again, like when we talk about homelessness in general, like families being allowed to stay together, things like that. Making sure housing programs are housing first, deal with warrants and ID after providing housing, consent to healthcare, and exemption for unhoused youth regarding curfew laws. Okay, so if we think about more of the transformative edge, transformation efforts that we could look to as far as like, how do we make things actually better for summer? I would love to hear folks' thoughts.
This is Kim.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm hearing an echo. Am I coming through okay?
It's not echoey on our end.
Okay.
So
okay. I was going to type all this, but I figured I would just share. And she said it was a small group. So I'm not sure if this is what you're thinking, but I know, so I'm in Delaware, and one of the things we're trying to do is bring together people who are working with this population to do a joint cohort group, not cohort, but a committee style conversation on where are we as a state, what can we do to move forward so that we can make these situations actually better and not just name all the issues, but see what we can do. So that's one thing that we're trying.
yeah, I love that. I think the coordination of systems, so maybe that gets us more towards like transformative edge, right? Like, because we're still talking about all these systems still exist. But can we actually get to a place where at least the systems that exist are talking to each other? And so one thing you might hear a lot is like this no wrong door idea. Like basically anytime, anyone in any of these systems, realizes that a youth is experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, that it shouldn't be like, oh, okay, well, you need to go over here and get, help from these other systems or services. That instead, the systems and services are coordinated enough that, any support person becoming aware of youth homelessness is able to help. That is something that definitely comes to mind when we think about like a transformative edge. Any other thoughts for transformation efforts? Do you want to share, Josh, a little bit about, I don't know, because I think there are some new folks on the call. Yeah.
Share about what?
Keep putting her on the spot.
So with our 2023 federal policy agenda, we wanted to make sure that it really starts moving towards making the New Deal come to life, right? And so we will have 3 policy recommendations. Those are your traditional asks, whether through legislation or through administrative asks. And then we'll have 3 policy positions, being a little stronger in our wording on an end state or a future state as it pertains directly to the New Deal. The first 2 that we will release, one recommendation and one position in the next couple of weeks. The policy recommendation is around a nationally funded low or no barrier cash transfer program for youth and young adults at risk or currently experiencing homelessness. And then our policy position that we will release as well is actualizing reparations for Black and Indigenous Americans through land and home ownership. So that's a little bit of what's coming as a next step beyond the New Deal.
Awesome. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot again.
Of course, when I ran out of water.
I know. I'm like, now you must speak with a dry throat. Okay, hold on. We've got a chat here. So let me just take a look. Oh, let's see. So Elias says, not sure if you mentioned this, but a one-stop shop where young people can find access to all the services they need. Yes, we probably did talk about that just as you cut out, essentially like the no wrong door idea. So I think, man, I think that sound is like always someone accidentally leaving the chat. So apologies if the connection isn't very good. But so one thing, I'll just pop up sort of my ideas here, if I can make it happen. It's like very, very touchy little PowerPoint today. Okay. So another one sort of just on the topic of no wrong door is like, do not require youth to engage with the child welfare system, law enforcement, the juvenile legal system to actually access services. Like, there should not be a requirement that you have to, get involved with one of these systems to be able to, access housing and services. One thing, and I know the New Deal website does talk about this quite a bit, is just the idea of like trusted community-based organizations, like organizations that are culturally competent, they're in tune with the needs of the community. If we could empower those organizations to help take care of youth, it could avoid a lot of problems with, involvement in some of these systems later. And the reason that we say like not, it's just like the statistics about them don't lie, right? Like, youth that are involved in the child welfare system, the chances that they will then become involved with like the juvenile legal system, and then later the criminal justice system, like those numbers are just very clear as far as the risks there. Also youth that are involved with the criminal or the juvenile legal system or the criminal legal system, the statistics are there as far as like the potential harm. It puts them at more risk for, physical and sexual assault. It puts them at risk for like a wide variety of other negative outcomes, like not being able to, finish school. There's just a bunch of negative effects of these things. So ideally, if we can just avoid, the contact with those systems, we might be that much further ahead with youth. As Josh mentioned, with Away Home America, we're looking at the guaranteed, a cash transfer is how they're saying it. And I think that probably meshes well with sort of the reparations framing. Another, you might hear it as like universal basic income or guaranteed income. These programs are being tested across the country. I'm excited to kind of see how those things go. New York City is going to do a cash transfer program, or maybe already is. California on a statewide level has implemented a cash transfer program. Denver.
A pilot UBI program.
Denver has a pilot UBI program. And there are a few other cities, like some other cities have tried it, not just for youth. There was like a small pilot program in Oakland. There's a couple pilot programs going on in Washington. Particularly, Denver's not youth specific. Okay. Yeah. There's one in Washington that specifically is a cash transfer program for Indigenous women. So anyway, it's at this point, sort of where it seems like, there's some, I think, hope in progressive legislatures. It seems like, a willingness to at least try these programs. And one thing I had mentioned in the earlier session, Chapin Hall through University of Chicago is kind of doing a lot of research around these programs and has a lot of resources if that's something you want to, try to float in your state. The other sort of transformation idea is just lots of housing options. Can we actually say, and, if you were in the last session, that like, maybe from a communications perspective, not everyone thinks that housing is a human right is an effective communication tool, but I feel like we could at least say that children have a right to housing. Like that seems pretty low bar. So, is there an avenue, like, sort of for children to have a right to housing, to make that very clear, and connected with that right is they have a right to housing, whether they are with their parents or have their parents consent or not. And so I think, that is something that we need to look at. And and then taking a look at sort of these other, the kinship care, in a transformation effort. I think it wouldn't really like be through the child welfare system, or it might not look in the same way. Maybe it would be more of like a community care framework. One thing I'll just flag, and maybe speaking about it extemporaneously, I might not be as accurate. And so, Jeremy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we are facing right now sort of a Supreme Court decision regarding the Indian Child Welfare Act that may, greatly affect the hard-fought rights of, Indigenous children to be able to stay within their communities when they are in the foster care system. And so that is something that we are keeping our eye on. It's a move in the wrong direction. It's away from transformation. And so I think that that's something that we need to be looking at closely, is any efforts to sort of erode any rights that youth have to sort of be with their families and communities of origin. Another thing I want to just bring up is zero youth detention. That's something, we have a lot of rhetoric about it in my home county of King County, Washington. It is a goal at the county level. They still did build a new youth jail, even despite having stated this goal. I think they're trying to frame it as like it's more of a secure housing facility rather than a jail, but seems pretty much like the old jail. So that's something to really think about. The other issue that I worry about in King County of how people try to get around it is then charging youth as adults rather than as juveniles. And so trying to get around, like basically claiming we have no youth detention, but then getting around it by trying to involve younger and younger kids in the criminal legal system. So, those are some things that we're thinking about. I mean, that to me should be a low-hanging fruit, that youth should not be charged as adults. But that would certainly be a transformation effort in our country if we got there. So I wanted to just, at this point, open it up if anyone has sort of any additional thoughts, questions. I'm taking a look at the chat. Yes, and no fines or fees to youth. This is such a good point, Kim. Like, one of the more maddening things that I dealt with in representing youth was sort of the collateral consequences of a juvenile record. And now there is automatic record sealing in Washington. I actually don't know if it's automatic if you owe fines and fees. I think they've moved in like a better direction since I was doing a lot of representation, but I mean, we could not seal a juvenile record until fines and fees were paid. And I mean, youth, I would see that had like $1,000 in fines and fees. And I'm like, there's no way this youth is going to be able to pay that. So it sounds like Delaware is changing it so there will not be fines and fees for youth. That is fantastic. That's great to hear. Kim, was that like a legislative advocacy effort, or was this just like a policy change? Do you know? It was
hugely advocate. Yeah, our campaign to end debtors prison here in Delaware fought hard for some fines and fees reform. And the first attempt, or several attempts, they struggled. But this last one that got through, some of the reforms were about youth specifically with fines and fees. So I'm pretty sure it's law now. I think it got signed in last month, but it was largely at the advocacy. And we work closely with our ACLU. So they were part of that too, to write the legislation. So it was advocacy, legislation, and then put into law.
That's just absolutely fantastic. I love to hear it. And, that we didn't really mention it much, even in our like reform efforts, but man, that's a huge one that could be enormously beneficial for youth. Yeah. Anybody else have anything that they wanted to share? I opened it up in the last session if anyone wanted to talk about any advocacy efforts that are being pursued. I know Kim talked a little bit about Delaware and Kim, I think I'll be on a call with you on December 1st. We're going to talk about sort of a bit of a package of what Delaware could potentially look at for improving the services and systems for homeless youth in your state, and funding for that matter. So I just didn't want to give the opportunity if there was anyone else who had something they wanted to share about advocacy in this coming year. I'm excited too. It's going to be awesome. Cool. Well, we might end up ending a little bit early, although we could definitely keep the conversation going. It's just we have such a small group that you know, I was thinking we'd have more questions and more discussion about advocacy efforts, but this is definitely an opportunity. If anyone has anything to add, feel free because we have time. Oh, and I should just double check too. Again, I don't think anyone online needed CLE credits, but did. No? Okay. Fabulous. Just making sure if anyone in person needed to sign in.
Well, I'll ask a question that's, I think it's related. Yeah. It's a little bit outside of the box, I suppose. But one of the things I've been looking into are programs that are focusing on job placement, programming that then gives them the holistic wraparound services too, but having it be foundationally focused on employment. And we don't have much of that here in Delaware. And I know some of the laws, you have to be 16 in some cases, et cetera. But I was just curious if you had any thoughts on how this helps some of the youth find that community, find that grounding, gives them some income, et cetera, as you think through all of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think so we didn't really get to it in this scenario because sounds good. We didn't get to it in Summer's scenario because Summer had too much else going on to access any job or job training programs. But yes, so one state that actually has a pretty robust system for like job training, apprenticeship, and then also some wraparound support services is actually Kansas. They have a very sort of like a system with their vocational high schools and their vocational colleges, where they really support unhoused youth and former foster youth to be able to access those sort of job trainings programs. And particularly, like, they're really looking at, like, it's like very skilled kind of, anyway, let me just say, I don't believe that anything is unskilled labor, but this is like those like more like trade type jobs, which can often be, higher paying sort of unionized jobs. So anyway, they not only sort of have this partnership between like, VOTEC high schools and colleges, they offer like free transportation for youth to be able to like access those programs, to be able to get to their job, training sites, and then eventually to their jobs. And so it really is an interesting program. Let me actually look and see, because I met the representative from Kansas. I think it was Representative Susan Estes, so like ESTES. She was really sort of instrumental. She kind of added the transportation component to their job training program. And I should say, Kansas is a very red state. This was obviously something that was very appealing, to them because of job training. But obviously is also very beneficial to youth. And so that was kind of an interesting way of doing it. So I just don't know, we have to see that you might have a sense of, like, in Delaware, if there's sort of that sort of VOTEC or community colleges or things like that, where there could be some kind of maybe like a partnership as far as some of these job training programs. But that's something that comes to mind when you said it. Another example I'll give is sort of in Seattle, the organization where I was actually the legal aid attorney that came once a week. It was called Youth Care in Seattle. And that, the funding for youth care was, primarily through sort of like HUD, continuum of care funding, specifically for homeless youth. And so it was a drop-in center, it was a case management center, and then within it, they also had very specific job training programs. They had a barista training program because, you know, we're in Seattle, so lots of coffee needs there. So, and they literally had within the site, like the classroom where youth could train to be baristas. And then there were certain coffee shops throughout the city where there was partnerships with them that they would, you know, oftentimes like agree to take on youth. And there was sort of a, you know, soft handoff where like case managers were still involved and able to help. They also had Fair Start was another program in Seattle, and that was specifically like, you know, culinary training. So, you know, working in restaurants from front of house, you know, to dishwashing, to managing, to ordering, like all of that stuff. That was another program that Youth Care was heavily involved with. And then youth could actually work at the Fair Start restaurant. And then from there, often we're able to move on to other sort of jobs in the community. But that's awesome. Thanks for the link for that other program. I will take a look at that after our session. Is there anything else? Right. Does look, I'm just kind of checking to see. I think poor Aaliyah keeps getting kicked off of the Zoom. That's too bad. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I'm excited to talk to you more soon too, Kim. I really appreciate everyone's participation today. Since no one's really getting the CLE credit, so I don't have to stick to the time frame, I'll end us a bit early rather than going on. I could like, I'd have to instead come up with like some lecture on some legal aspect of youth homelessness, but I will spare you that. And thanks again for participating, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Oh, and I'm going to just quickly throw my email address in the chat in case anyone wants to get in touch about advocacy efforts. And be sure to check out, you know, the Youth State Index website. Wait, homelesslaw.org. That's me. So it's Meyer-Scott at homelesslaw.org. That's my contact info. And look forward to working with you all in the future. All right, bye, everyone.